Try not to talk too much tonight, my husband whispered while adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror of our hotel suite. These investors expect a certain level of sophistication. I stood there holding the earrings he bought me 3 Christmases ago, while his phone lit up again with messages from a woman named Vanessa. He saw me glance down and calmly flipped the screen over. "Don't start," he said. "Not tonight." 10 minutes later, downstairs in the ballroom, his coworkers laughed when one of them asked if I still worked that little remote admin job. My husband smiled into his bourbon and answered for me. "Claire likes keeping things simple." Simple. That word sat in my chest like broken glass while I stared at the crystal chandeliers hanging 30 feet above us. Then the CEO of the development firm walked straight past my husband, ignored the entire table, and reached for my hand. "Claire Bennett," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I've been trying to get you on this project for 6 months." The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut skin. My husband's smile froze. One of his friends blinked at me and asked, "Wait, you know Mr. Whitmore?" I smiled politely. "We've worked together for almost 2 years. Nobody spoke after that, not even my husband. And before I tell you what happened next, if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now, but only if this story speaks to your heart. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and the night my husband tried to make me feel small in front of his wealthy colleagues became the night everything inside our marriage finally cracked open. Looking back now, I think part of me already knew something was wrong long before that gala. Maybe it started 6 months earlier when Ethan stopped asking about my work entirely. Or maybe it started the moment he realized his career was slowing down, while mine was quietly exploding behind closed doors. Either way, by the time we arrived at the Whitmore Grand Hotel that Friday night in downtown Chicago, we were already pretending to be a happy couple. The ballroom smelled like expensive cologne, champagne, and polished wood. A jazz trio played near the marble staircase, while servers carried trays of lobster crostini through clusters of investors wearing watches worth more than my first car. Ethan kept one hand lightly against my back the entire evening, steering me from conversation to conversation, like he was afraid I might embarrass him if left unattended. "Smile more," he whispered once through clenched teeth. "You look intimidating." I almost laughed at that because if he really knew who I was, intimidating would have been the least frightening thing about me. Around 9:30, Ethan disappeared to take a phone call. I stepped out into the hallway near the private conference suites to get some air, and that's when I heard a woman's voice behind the partially closed door. "She still has no idea, does she?" she asked softly. Then my husband answered in a voice so cold I barely recognized it. "Not yet. But after tonight, she won't have a choice." I froze outside that conference room with my hand still wrapped around the stem of a champagne glass I had not even tasted. My husband laughed softly on the other side of the door, low and familiar, the same laugh he used when he wanted people to trust him. "Claire always thinks everything is fine as long as nobody raises their voice," he said. The woman answered quietly, almost amused. "And after the merger?" There was a pause. "After the merger," Ethan replied, "she will sign whatever I put in front of her." Something cold moved through my chest then. Not anger yet, recognition. Because suddenly, every small moment from the last 2 years started lining up in my head like dominoes tipping over. Ethan had always been good at making me feel unreasonable for noticing things. When we were dating, his mother once looked directly at me during Thanksgiving dinner and asked, "Do you ever worry Ethan will outgrow you professionally?" I remember nearly dropping the serving spoon into the sweet potatoes while everyone at the table laughed softly like she had made some harmless joke. Ethan squeezed my knee under the table afterward and whispered, "She means well. Do not make it awkward." That became the pattern in his family. His younger brother Tyler got celebrated for buying a condo at 26, while I sat quietly beside Ethan after closing a 6-figure consulting contract the same week. His father framed Tyler's mortgage papers in his office as a joke. Meanwhile, when Ethan casually mentioned my promotion one Christmas Eve, his mother smiled tightly and said, "That is wonderful, Claire. Confidence looks good on you." Confidence, not success, not achievement. Like my accomplishments were accessories I happened to be wearing that season. I learned early that in the Calloway family, men built empires while women supported them quietly from the background. The strange part was that I let myself adapt to it. I stopped correcting people when they minimized my work. I smiled through dinners where Ethan explained finance to me like I had not spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar restructuring deals myself. I told myself marriage meant compromise, partnership, patience, but standing outside that conference room listening to my husband discuss me like a problem waiting to be managed, I realized something painful. Ethan had never underestimated me by accident, and deep down, I think his family knew exactly who I was long before he did. 3 years earlier, before the gala dinners and whispered conversations behind closed doors, I was sitting alone in a tiny coffee shop on West Madison Street, staring at a spreadsheet that looked impossible to fix. The heating system inside the cafe rattled every few minutes, and snow pressed against the windows in thick gray waves while the owner of a failing apartment complex cried quietly across from me. "If this does not work, mister," Delaney said, rubbing both hands over his face, "I lose everything my father built." I remember looking down at the numbers again. Vacancy rates, debt ratios, vendor fraud hidden inside maintenance contracts. Most consultants had already walked away from him after charging $20,000 just to tell him the situation was hopeless. I closed the folder slowly and asked him one question. "How honest are you willing to get about what is really happening here?" That project changed my life. 6 months later, the building was profitable again. Occupancy was back above 90%, and word started spreading quietly through Chicago real estate circles that there was a woman solving problems nobody else could untangle. My phone began ringing at all hours. Luxury developers, investors, restaurant groups, hotel owners, men twice my age asking for my opinion in careful voices after initially assuming I was somebody's assistant. Meanwhile, Ethan acted strangely every time my success became visible. The first time I was invited to speak at an investor conference downtown, he stared at the invitation for a few seconds too long before saying, "You are not actually thinking of going alone, right?" I laughed softly because I thought he was joking. He was not. At dinner with his parents that Sunday, his mother folded her napkin carefully and asked, "Claire, do you think all this ambition is healthy for a marriage?" Tyler smirked into his wine glass. "Yeah, Ethan. Better lock down a prenup before she becomes a billionaire." Everyone laughed except Ethan. He stayed quiet the entire drive home, one hand tight around the steering wheel while rain hit the windshield in nervous little bursts. Finally, he said, "You know people are starting to talk, right?" I turned toward him slowly. "About what?" He kept his eyes on the road. "About how successful you are becoming." I should have understood then that something inside our marriage had already started shifting, because a week later, Ethan introduced me to someone named Vanessa. And from the moment she smiled at me across that rooftop bar, I had the strange feeling she already knew far too much about my life. Vanessa wore white the first night I met her. Not cream, not ivory, white. The kind that catches rooftop lighting and makes everyone else look slightly faded beside her. She hugged Ethan first, too comfortably for strangers, then turned to me with a polished smile that never fully reached her eyes. "I have heard so much about you," she said, touching my arm lightly. "Ethan talks about you constantly." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. Ethan ordered drinks immediately and spent most of the evening talking to her about investment firms, luxury developments, and private equity contacts while I sat quietly beside them watching the city lights flicker across the Chicago River below us. Every time I tried joining the conversation, Ethan interrupted gently. "Claire is more on the operations side," he explained once with a small laugh. "She likes spreadsheets more than people." Vanessa smiled sympathetically at me like I was a child being included at the adults' table. After that night, her name started appearing everywhere. Ethan suddenly had late meetings twice a week. Weekend networking brunches. Investor dinners that somehow never included spouses anymore. And every time I questioned it, he looked exhausted instead of guilty. "You are being paranoid," he told me one Tuesday night while loosening his tie in our kitchen. "Vanessa is helping me secure a promotion. Not everything is an affair." I remember standing barefoot on the cold marble floor staring at him while the dishwasher hummed softly behind us. "Then why did she text you at 1:30 this morning?" Ethan exhaled hard like I was the difficult one. "Because adults work late, Claire." Over time, the story spread exactly the way he wanted it to. His family started treating me carefully, almost pityingly. Tyler asked one afternoon if I was handling all the stress okay. His mother began recommending therapists during Sunday dinners. Even our friends looked uncomfortable around me, like Ethan had quietly convinced everyone I was unstable. insecure, emotional. The worst part was how believable he made it sound. He held doors open for me in public, kissed my forehead at parties, called me sweetheart while slowly dismantling my credibility behind closed doors. Then one Friday afternoon, I arrived early at Ethan's office carrying the navy blue portfolio he forgot at home. His assistant looked startled when she saw me. "Oh," she said too quickly. "I thought Vanessa already brought that upstairs." I smiled politely and stepped toward the conference room anyway. But the moment I reached the half-open door and heard Ethan laughing inside, everything I thought was still salvageable collapsed completely. I stood outside that conference room for less than 10 seconds, but it was enough to destroy 7 years of marriage. Vanessa was leaning against the edge of the table inside, laughing softly while Ethan sat beside her with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up the way he always did when he was relaxed. Comfortable, honest. "She still thinks I need her emotionally," he said with a quiet smile. I had not seen directed at me in months. Vanessa tilted her head. "And financially?" Ethan laughed again. "Please. Claire would fall apart without me. I do not remember leaving the building. I only remember sitting inside my car in the underground garage staring at my phone while Chicago traffic echoed faintly through the concrete walls around me. 10 minutes later, Ethan called. I watched his name flash across the screen until it stopped. Then another call came. Then another. Finally a text. "Where did you go?" Another one followed almost immediately. "You are embarrassing me." That was the moment something inside me finally went still. Over the next week, Ethan transformed into someone desperate and strangely careful. Flowers arrived at the condo Tuesday morning with a handwritten card that read, "You know you are the only person who really understands me." Wednesday night, he emailed me restaurant reservations for Napa Valley with the subject line, "Fresh Start." Thursday, he stood outside my office building in the rain, holding coffee from the cafe downstairs like we were still 27, and fixing things was simple. "Claire, please talk to me," he said quietly when I finally stopped walking. "You misunderstood what you heard." I looked at him for a long moment. "Did I?" Ethan rubbed one hand across his jaw. "Vanessa is helping me secure investors, that is all." "Then why did she have access to private details about our finances?" His face changed for half a second. Tiny, almost invisible, but I saw it. That same night, I checked our shared accounts for the first time in months and noticed 3 wire transfers I did not recognize. Large ones, each labeled consulting expenses. Each approved by Ethan. I called him immediately, straight to voicemail. By Friday morning, his mother left me a message saying, "Marriage requires forgiveness, Claire. Do not throw everything away over misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. I sat alone in the dark living room, listening to her voicemail replay, while the city lights flickered through the windows around me. Somewhere during those silent hours, I realized something devastating. Nobody in Ethan's world was waiting to hear my side of the story. 2 weeks after I discovered the wire transfers, my father died quietly in a hospice room 30 miles outside Chicago, while snow drifted against the windows in slow, uneven patterns. Lung cancer, stage 4. By the end, he barely had enough strength to hold my hand for more than a few minutes at a time. Ethan came to the hospital once. He stood awkwardly near the doorway holding a paper cup of coffee while checking his phone every few minutes. "I am sorry about your dad," he said softly, but his voice sounded distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. My father noticed too. After Ethan stepped into the hallway to answer a call, Dad looked at me carefully from the bed. "That man stopped seeing you a long time ago, Claire." I remember trying to smile. "You are exhausted. Do not start." But Dad shook his head slowly. "No, listen to me." His breathing rattled painfully for a second before he continued. "You spent your whole life making yourself easier for other people to love." Those were some of the last clear words he ever said to me. 3 days later, he was gone. After the funeral, everybody disappeared back into their own lives with shocking speed. My cousins returned to Indianapolis. My aunt flew home to Denver. Ethan said he had an investor conference in New York he could not miss. "This deal affects both our futures," he explained while packing a suitcase in the bedroom we barely shared anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the black tie he had thrown over the dresser after the funeral. "Do you even want to be here?" I asked quietly. Ethan stopped folding shirts for half a second before answering. "Claire, I cannot keep having these conversations." Then he left. The condo felt enormous after that. Too quiet. The refrigerator hummed through empty rooms, while untouched sympathy flowers slowly wilted near the kitchen windows. At night I slept curled against one side of the bed while cold space stretched beside me like another kind of grief entirely. And somewhere inside all that silence, something unexpected started happening. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself how to save my marriage. I started asking a different question instead. What exactly had Ethan been hiding from me all this time? The Monday after Ethan left for New York, I walked into my office before sunrise, carrying a paper cup of burnt coffee and a legal pad covered in notes from the night before. The city outside my windows still looked half asleep, gray light stretching slowly across downtown Chicago, while snowmelt dripped from the edges of nearby rooftops. For the first time in months, nobody was texting me asking where I was, who I was meeting, or when I would be home. The silence felt strange at first. Then it started feeling peaceful. I threw myself into work because work at least responded logically when you gave it enough attention. A struggling hotel chain in Milwaukee, a commercial property dispute in Denver, a restaurant group in Dallas hemorrhaging nearly $80,000 a month because of vendor fraud buried inside supplier contracts. Every problem had patterns. Every crisis left fingerprints if you looked carefully enough. Unlike people, one evening, around 8:30, my assistant Nora leaned against my office doorway, holding 2 folders against her chest. "You know you have not gone home before midnight in almost 2 weeks, right?" she asked carefully. I glanced up from my laptop. "Is that your professional assessment?" She smiled faintly. "That is my human assessment." I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. Small, rusted around the edges, but real. Over the next few weeks, things started moving fast. Investors who had ignored me before suddenly wanted meetings. One of my redevelopment projects got featured in a national business journal. Another client referred me to a private equity group managing over $4 billion in assets. I never announced any of it publicly. I just kept working quietly while Ethan continued, assuming I was emotionally falling apart somewhere without him. Then one Thursday afternoon, Nora stepped into my office, holding a thick cream-colored envelope with raised gold lettering across the front. "This came by courier," she said. I opened it slowly and stared down at the invitation inside. Whitmore Capital Annual Leadership Gala. Private guest list. Requested attendance. Claire Bennett and guest. At the bottom was a handwritten note from James Whitmore himself. "I believe it is time certain people finally understand exactly who you are." I read that sentence twice, while something cold and steady settled inside my chest. Because for the first time since my father died, I had the strange feeling life was quietly positioning pieces into place. The Whitmore Gala happened on a Friday night in early October at the top of the Langford Tower, overlooking Lake Michigan. By then, everything in my life looked different, even if Ethan still believed I was the same woman he could quietly control. My company had doubled in value in less than 18 months. I had 12 employees, 3 major redevelopment contracts across the Midwest, and a waiting list of investors trying to schedule meetings I no longer had time to accept. Yet somehow the thing that changed me most was smaller than all of that. It was the new brass nameplate Nora ordered for my office door without telling me. Claire Bennett, Chief Executive Officer. I remember staring at it one morning while sunlight hit the letters across the glass. Not because I needed the title, but because for years I had made myself smaller every time someone else felt uncomfortable with my success. I stopped doing that. The night of the gala, I wore a black tailored dress with long sleeves and simple diamond studs my father bought me after my first successful contract years earlier. No designer logos, no dramatic entrance, just quiet certainty. When I arrived at the ballroom, the valet outside immediately recognized me. "Good evening, Miss Bennett," he said while opening the door. Inside, executives I had only spoken to over conference calls crossed the room to shake my hand. "Claire, fantastic to finally meet you in person. Your Denver restructuring deal was brilliant. James speaks about you constantly." Across the ballroom, I finally saw Ethan standing beside Vanessa near the investor tables. He looked confident at first, relaxed. Then James Whitmore stepped onto the small stage near the orchestra and tapped his champagne glass lightly. "Before tonight continues," he announced warmly, "there is one person in this room I would personally like to recognize." Ethan turned toward the stage with the same polite expression everybody else wore. Then James smiled directly at me. "Claire Bennett," he said clearly, "the woman responsible for saving 3 of the largest redevelopment projects in this company's history." The room erupted into applause while Ethan's face slowly emptied of color. Vanessa looked confused for exactly 2 seconds before realization finally reached her eyes. And standing there beneath those crystal chandeliers listening to hundreds of people applaud work my own husband never even bothered to understand, I realized we had finally returned to the exact moment where everything truly began to break apart. The applause faded slowly, but the tension inside that ballroom only grew heavier after James Whitmore introduced me. I could feel eyes following me everywhere as servers moved between tables, carrying champagne and polished silver trays of crab cakes. Nobody seemed interested in eating anymore. Ethan stayed near the investor section, pretending to smile through conversations while Vanessa stood beside him too stiffly, one hand wrapped around the stem of her wine glass like she needed something solid to hold on to. I stayed calm. That was the strange part. Months earlier, I would have been shaking. Now I just felt clear. Around 10:15, James leaned toward me during dinner and lowered his voice slightly. "I assume you know what your husband has been trying to negotiate behind your back." I looked at him carefully across the candlelit table. "Not everything," I answered honestly. James gave a small nod like that confirmed something for him. "Then you should probably prepare yourself." Before I could ask another question, Ethan suddenly appeared beside my chair, wearing the controlled expression he always used when he felt cornered. "Claire," he said quietly, "can we talk privately for a second?" James leaned back slowly without saying a word. Ethan guided me toward one of the side hallways near the private conference suites, while music from the ballroom faded behind us into a distant hum. The second we were alone, his entire posture changed. "What exactly are you doing tonight?" he asked under his breath. I stared at him. "Existing publicly seems to be upsetting you." Ethan exhaled sharply and ran one hand through his hair. "You blindsided me in there." "No, Ethan, you just never thought anybody important would notice me." His jaw tightened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that made the air leave my lungs completely. "You were never supposed to find out this way." Somewhere down the hallway, a conference room door opened softly. I turned instinctively toward the sound and saw Vanessa stepping out holding a thin black folder against her chest. The moment she noticed me standing there beside Ethan, she froze, and in that exact second, I finally understood that whatever they had been hiding was much bigger than an affair. Vanessa's face lost color the second I looked down at the black folder in her hands, because I recognized it immediately. Whitmore Capital Acquisition Documents. My acquisition documents. Ethan stepped forward too quickly, like he could still control the direction of the conversation if he moved fast enough. "Claire," he said quietly, "let us not do this here." I looked at him calmly. "Do what exactly?" Neither of them answered. The hallway around us felt strangely silent, except for the distant sound of piano music drifting from the ballroom. Finally, Vanessa spoke first, her voice careful and measured. "You were never supposed to be hurt by this." I almost laughed at how polished that sounded, like betrayal became acceptable if explained gently enough. "Then explain it to me," I said. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face before lowering his voice. "Whitmore Capital has been preparing a merger with your company for months." "I know that." "No," he replied softly. "You know the public version." That was when Vanessa slowly opened the folder in her hands and turned one page toward me. My eyes landed on Ethan's signature first, then hers, then the final line beneath both names. Transitional Executive Authority upon acquisition. My stomach tightened instantly. "You were planning to take control of my company," I said quietly. Ethan stepped closer. "Temporary control. Claire, listen to me. Investors were nervous about your emotional state after your father died. Vanessa and I convinced them stability mattered." Stability. I stared at him for several long seconds while pieces finally connected inside my head. The wire transfers, the secret meetings, the sudden concern from his family, the quiet campaign painting me as unstable. It had never just been personal betrayal. It had been strategic. Vanessa swallowed hard before speaking again. "The board believed Ethan could protect the company while you recovered." Recovered. Like grief had made me incompetent. Behind us, voices from the ballroom started getting closer as several investors stepped into the hallway mid-conversation before suddenly stopping when they saw our faces. Ethan noticed them too. Panic flickered across his expression for the first time all night. I kept my voice calm. "You forged an entire narrative around my life without ever asking if I was broken." "Claire," Ethan whispered, "please." I looked directly at him then, really looked at him. And what shocked me most was not the betrayal itself. It was realizing he genuinely believed I would never be powerful enough to uncover it. The news traveled through that ballroom faster than music. By the time Ethan and I walked back toward the main floor, conversations had already shifted into hushed fragments behind champagne glasses and polite smiles. People stopped talking when we passed. Investors who had spent the last year shaking Ethan's hand now looked at him carefully, like they were reevaluating something they thought they understood. Vanessa disappeared almost immediately after that hallway conversation. I never saw her return to the ballroom. Ethan's mother arrived 20 minutes later wearing a silver evening coat over her formal dress, clearly called in after someone warned her things were going badly. She pulled me aside near the staircase with the same controlled expression she always used when trying to manage appearances. "Claire," she said quietly, "whatever disagreement happened tonight should stay private." I looked at her calmly. "You already knew about the acquisition plan, did you not?" Her silence answered for her. "Ethan was trying to protect your company," she finally said. "He was trying to protect himself," I replied. She glanced around nervously before lowering her voice further. "Marriage requires compromise." I almost smiled at that because compromise had apparently meant allowing people to quietly rewrite my life while expecting gratitude in return. A few feet away, Ethan stood speaking with James Whitmore, but his posture had changed completely now. Smaller somehow, less certain. For years I had watched him command rooms effortlessly while I stayed quiet beside him. Now he could barely maintain eye contact with people he once impressed so easily. Later that evening he found me standing alone near the terrace overlooking the lake. Cold wind moved softly through the open doors behind me while the city lights reflected across dark water below. "Claire," he said carefully, "I know you hate me right now." "I do not hate you," I answered honestly. "That would require me to still trust you emotionally." Ethan flinched slightly at that. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question that finally revealed how little he understood me after all these years. "What happens now?" I looked out across the skyline before answering. "Now you learn what life looks like when I stop making myself smaller for your comfort." Ethan swallowed hard, but I could already see it in his face. He still believed this was a crisis he could eventually fix. What he did not understand yet was that some betrayals do not end relationships immediately. They simply remove the illusion that the relationship ever truly existed in the first place. 6 months after the gala, I moved out of the condo Ethan and I once shared and into a quiet brownstone on the north side of Chicago, with tall windows, uneven hardwood floors, and a small reading chair beside the kitchen window where morning sunlight landed around 7:30 every day. The divorce was finalized without drama, no screaming, no courtroom scenes, just signatures, silence, and two people finally acknowledging the truth they should have faced years earlier. Ethan stepped down from the acquisition negotiations 3 weeks after Whitmore Capital launched an internal review into the unauthorized restructuring plan. Vanessa quietly left the firm before the investigation finished. I never spoke to either of them again after the last mediation meeting. Oddly enough, I do not remember feeling victorious when it all ended. Mostly I felt tired, then lighter, like carrying something heavy for so long that your body forgets what standing normally feels like until the weight is finally gone. My company continued growing after that, but I protected it differently now. Separate accounts, independent legal oversight, boundaries I should have established years earlier instead of mistaking trust for unconditional access. Sometimes late at night, I still hear my father's voice in my head from that hospice room. "You spent your whole life making yourself easier for other people to love. For a long time I thought love meant shrinking parts of myself so someone else could feel taller beside me. I know better now. Real love does not require you to disappear quietly inside your own life. It does not punish your success. It does not ask you to become smaller just to keep someone else comfortable. And if you are listening to this right now while questioning your instincts, your worth, or the way someone makes you feel invisible, please hear me clearly. Your intuition notices things long before your heart is ready to accept them. Protect your finances. Protect your name. Protect your peace. And never confuse being needed with being valued. Healing was not dramatic for me. It looked like sleeping through the night again. Cooking dinner without anxiety sitting in my chest. Taking long walks along Lake Michigan without checking my phone every 5 minutes. It looked like finally becoming someone my younger self would have recognized immediately. Last month, Nora stopped by my office carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the old brass nameplate she had ordered years earlier. Claire Bennett, Chief Executive Officer. I laughed softly when I saw it because the edges were scratched now from moving offices twice, but somehow that made it feel more honest, more real. I keep it on the bookshelf behind my desk, now beside a framed photograph of my father smiling in his old Cubs jacket. Some mornings before meetings, I glance at both of them and remember something simple. Losing people who never truly respected your voice is not failure. Sometimes it is the first honest step toward hearing your own again. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 34 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never abandon yourself just to preserve a relationship that only survives when you stay small. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Truly. If any part of it spoke to your heart, I hope it reminded you that you are not difficult for wanting honesty, respect, and peace. You are not asking for too much by wanting to be seen clearly. And maybe that quiet feeling inside you, the one you keep trying to ignore, is not fear at all. Maybe it is God or the universe gently trying to guide you back toward yourself. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what part stayed with you most. And if you would like to hear more stories about resilience, betrayal, healing, and finding yourself again after heartbreak, I hope you will subscribe and spend a little more time with us here. There are more stories waiting in this playlist. More women and men who slowly discovered their worth after years of silence. And if tonight's story stayed with you after the screen fades to black, I think the next one might too.